Church Committee unfortunately did not name very many of these organizations because those that got named, of course, had to close down immediately. But it was learned that even things like the Rome Daily American, which was a major English language newspaper in Rome, for 20, 30 years had been owned by the CIA. This was published, and of course the paper closed the next day. But most people didn't realize the extent of the intelligence media organization is fairly incredible. They sort of brag about it. When you read the books about the history of the CIA, one of the heroes was the first man in charge of media operations, a man named Frank Wisner, and they referred to his organization as the Mighty Wurlitzer. And there's this image of this guy sitting at one of those giant organs, you know, with 17 keyboards, and you're playing this sort of like the Phantom of the Opera in that scene. And there was the guy running the CIA media operations all around the world. And he really was, because every single city of any size on Earth, he had some employee who was supposedly worked for a newspaper or a magazine or a radio station or a wire service. And they could get stories anywhere.
Can you give just one or two more specific examples?
Yeah, there was one, actually in an article that was published, written by a former CIA officer named James Wilcott, who was not in the propaganda division. He was in finance, but he was so amazed he wrote a little article about this. And he was stationed in Japan one time, and there was a big debate raging there over whether nuclear-powered ships should be allowed to dock in Japanese ports. It was always been a very touchy issue, and at least since Hiroshima, it's been a very touchy issue in Japan, even peaceful uses of nuclear power. And the U.S. line was to promote the docking of nuclear power ships, because the U.S. had more and more of them. So they wanted the Japanese papers to editorialize in favor of this, and the debate that was going on. And Jim said he looked and saw this guy at a nearby desk sit down and type, this is a CIA officer, an employee of the U.S. government, type an editorial, and then waved goodbye to everybody, left the office. The next morning, that appeared as the editorial, the lead editorial in the largest newspaper in Japan. Now that level, they didn't go to a friendly publisher and say, gee, we'd sort of like it if you could maybe do something a little bit favorable to this issue. They wrote the editorial, they handed it to the guy, and the next day, in Japanese, it appears in the paper. Another thing showing the influence here in this country was during the Vietnam War. I don't know, well, some people my age will remember it. There was a Life magazine that had a cover picture of a North Vietnamese stamp that showed the Vietnamese shooting down American planes. And it showed U.S. planes with U.S. markings in bursts of flames and crashing, and U.S. pilots being killed. And it was a pretty bizarre and gruesome set of postage stamps. And there was a whole story in there basically trying to give the line that the Vietnamese were glorifying the killing of Americans, and they thought it was so great to kill Americans that they were putting it on their postage stamps. The only thing that was later learned is that these were not North Vietnamese stamps. They were CIA forgeries, had never been real stamps. And the CIA was able to have them appear on the cover of Life magazine as if they were the real thing. That level of influence is something that many people don't realize. And when you read the congressional reports, page after page after page, it's absolutely astonishing how, given the urgency, and given that they had hundreds of millions of dollars at their command, they could get almost anything to appear almost anywhere.
What about the FBI domestic propaganda?
Well, the FBI, there's much less documentation, again, because the official position is that the FBI doesn't do this, whereas the official position is that the CIA does do it, although they tried not to talk about it. But what did come out in the congressional reports primarily is that a major FBI division that was called the Crime Reporting Division was theoretically supposed to keep track of how federal crimes were being reported. Why that was their business, I don't know, but that's what its theory was. But in fact, what it was doing was a whole division set up to keep track of journalists and reporters and magazines and newspapers to decide who could be counted on to write stories that the FBI wanted written, who would slant stories the way they wanted it. The question of whether these particular reporters were actually FBI employees, like so many were CIA employees, is unclear. That's never been admitted by the government that the FBI actually took its own employees and had them get a job as a correspondent on a newspaper, let's say, whereas we know that the CIA did that in many, many places. There's no reason to think they couldn't have done it, other than the fact that it hasn't yet been exposed. But in any event, there were significant pressures available to the FBI to use their friends, and the Church Committee report gives many examples, copies of memos from Hoover on down, where there'd be a thing attached and it said, "Get this information to our friends at the Copley News Service. Get this information to our friends at Reader's Digest. Get this to our friendly AP reporter," and so on. And then, of course, they would show the clipping indicating that, in fact, someone had gotten it to their friends, and it would then go over the wires or appear in the stories.
Let's turn now to the use of the media in this type of campaign activity against Martin Luther King Jr. But before you do that, could you tell the court and the jury what are the sources of underlying your testimony in this aspect?
Yes, I did a goodly amount of additional research and preparation in contemplation of appearing here, and there really are two main sources. The first, of course, is the various congressional reports that we talked about. In addition to reports about general operations or misconduct of the CIA or the FBI, there have been specific studies, I don't know if they've been mentioned in this case, but there have been specific studies relating to Martin Luther King Jr., both with respect to attacks on him while he was alive and also specific reports with respect to his murder. There was an entire volume published from one of the Senate investigations on the FBI media campaign against Dr. King. And there was a House committee that published a volume investigating his assassination. And these, of course, are the most important sources for what I'm talking about and what other people have written about, because they have a great deal of government documentation in them, which no private journalist could ever get their hands on. There are things in there that even the best of research wouldn't be able to obtain, but the congressional committees had subpoena powers and were able to amass thousands of documents, most of which were photocopied and attached to their reports.
For our purposes here, as well as those sources, what other sources have you used?
Well, I've also, of course, reviewed many books that have been written on the subject, and hundreds of articles, and I've done briefcases full of clippings that were major stories written about Dr. King, particularly in the last few years of his life, and then most of the coverage in the first few years of the James Earl Ray case, both before and after his guilty plea. There was very intensive coverage, as you can imagine. And throughout the 60s and into the early 70s, there was quite a bit of coverage in those clippings that I've been able to find. I've reviewed some of the sporadic coverage in the 80s and 90s. I've also been able to assemble and review, although the level of that coverage has decreased very much over the last decade or so.